All right, it looks to be 6:30 on the dot. Good evening, everyone. I'm super excited to have you on for the first night of our Fall Master Beef webinar series. My name is Mallory. I'm a graduate student here at the University of Tennessee under Dr. Katie Mason. She's our Master Beef coordinator, so she's super excited to put on this program for everyone as well. You'll see her throughout the series, and I'll be helping as one of your many hosts that you see throughout this series as well. You'll also see Adela Lonis. She's a graduate student under Dr. Salo Zoka, so if you see another familiar face, be sure to say hi to her as well. Just a couple of housekeeping things before we get started here tonight with Mr. Ferguson. Be sure that you have registered for all 8 of our webinars. There are 8 in this series, and so pretty sure you have to have 7 to receive your certification, so we want to make sure everyone's registered for each of those. If you have any questions about registering for any of the webinars, you can reach out to me or Dr. Mason or your county agent, and we'll be able to direct you in the right way. But with all that being said, I'll go ahead and introduce Mr. Ferguson. He is one of our extension area specialists and the managed program coordinator, and he's joined us here tonight to talk about some farm transitions and estate planning. So we're super excited to have him with us.
All right. Thanks, Mallory. As we do a little bit of a transition here, we'll see if I can share my screen in just a moment. Thanks everyone for joining. I guess it's a late afternoon, early evening for some. Okay, give me a thumbs up. Does that work? You seeing it? Can you see the screen? Okay, you're good. All right, thanks everyone. Just to let you know, when we talk about the subject of farm transition or estate planning, we're not going to cover the whole gamut here tonight. Hopefully, we're just going to pique your interest a little bit from that standpoint of talking about farm transition planning, estate planning from that standpoint. And you'll see, actually, we in the Center of Farm Management, we do a program called Farmland Legacy. That's a multi-night course to kind of really bring in the detail. But why has farm transition planning seen kind of an increase in interest in the last, I'd say the last year and a half across the state? Well, American Farmland Trust put out some information a number of years ago now that said the ownership of 40% of America's ag land will be in transition within the next 15 years. And when you think about that, that's 40% of our ag land is going to be in transition. Somebody else is going to be making the management decisions on that farm. Well, about the same time, they put out a study. They looked at data from 2001 through 2016, and they identified what they call the nationally significant ag land that we have in the U.S. This is our most productive land. This is the most productive acres, the acres that they say we need to keep in production to feed the U.S. and to feed the world. And Tennessee at the time, they said we had approximately 4.5 million acres of that nationally significant ag land. Well, they also look then at conversion of ag land. And what we're looking at here is a map that, in addition to the nationally significant ag land, they put in what's depicted in green are above average production land. They called it a PVR index. But they looked at, and what you see depicted in red is the amount of land that was initially in farmland that was converted or lost between 2001 and 2016. And they noted that that was 211,000 acres of that was that nationally significant ag land, and 277,000 acres total was the above production land. But if you can look, it's probably no surprise to you as where the red shows up, where we're converting that land. They looked at some assumptions and said that basically 80% of that conversion went to low density or housing, residential housing across the state. 22% of it, of course, was then into commercial. But kind of what got a lot of people's attention is they looked at the rate that states were losing farmland, and then is there any policy in place to slow that land down? And they rated the most threatened states in the U.S. to lose farmland, and Tennessee wound up in that ranking that came out sometime after that 2016 study as the fourth most threatened state in the U.S. to lose farmland. Well, I began presenting this, 3-4 years ago, something like that. And I said, what would this look like today if we could update this map? Well, approximately a year ago, American Farmland Trust came out with a new projection, and they took their data from 2001 through 2016, and they projected it through 2040. And they said during that time period, Tennessee could easily lose another 1 million acres of farmland. And the one thing that they noted, and you will see on the next slide, they said we could lose another 1 million acres of farmland. 52% of it would occur on Tennessee's best land. I often ask, why is the best land seen and used for development? It's because, of course, the best land for farming, flat, deep soils, also is one that's your best in terms of development. No surprise when they talk about the hardest hit counties across the state: Rutherford, Sevier, Williamson. But in this update, Tennessee moved up to the third most threatened state in the U.S. And the one thing in their terms, and the one thing that this model doesn't depict for our friends over in West Tennessee, again, their data was collected up through 2016. So this model forecasting through 2040 doesn't include what's been projected to happen down in West Tennessee in Haywood County and surrounding counties with the Blue Oval, Ford's Blue Oval City that's going in. Well, the one thing that their site makes very interesting is you can go on and look up Farms Under Threat 2040. And they have actually an interactive map that you can click on any county in the state and pull it up. I happen to live in Rutherford County. It's one of the counties that's known for the highest rate of farmland loss in the state. And you can pull it up and look at American Farmlands Trust projection through the next 15 years, or from 2016 up through 2040. They have a couple of different scenarios. One they call business as usual if they stay online with their model. And then they have another called runaway sprawl, where if we have more development and more conversion into residential land, and in Rutherford County alone, they're projecting another loss of 40,000 up to 50,000 acres of farmland by 2040. Well, I'm with the university, and a year ago, back in July, we formed the Center of Farm Management and allowed us to look at a lot of different and hopefully new projects. We got approached with, is this information correct? Are we losing farmland at this rate? This is a topic that's being discussed across the state. And I know Dr. Charlie Martinez with the Center of Farm Management is kind of leading the effort to how can we actually see how much land has been lost. We've looked at a lot of databases, and what you're seeing on the screen is kind of where we landed most recently, or the last thing that we've looked at, is to get actual parcel data from the counties. Can we get GIS parcel data from all the counties across the state, and hopefully develop a page of information, or a one-pager as we're calling it, to let individual counties know how much land has been lost in that county, say over the past 10 years. I happen to have the example here for Sumner County because that happened to be the county that we got the data from, their GIS data from, over a number of years. And what you're looking at on the left is depicted by all the individual parcels in that county from 2011 through 2022. What shows up in blue, that's ag land that's in Greenbelt. What's in red is farmland or ag land that's not in Greenbelt. You'll see green, which is land that's in forestry. And don't be concerned that you see more green over here in 2022 as you do in 2020 and 2011, because what happened is they changed classifications. They classified more of the land as forest land. But what you need to pick up on is how much more white do you see? And that's the individual parcels that change from farmland to developed, whether it's residential or commercial. And to give you an idea of what we found here in that time period is that during that time period of 2011 to 2022 in Sumner County, they had a net farmland loss of 35,820 acres. And for those that are not familiar with Sumner County, you can just kind of look at this and see this is a roadway. This is Highway 52 from Westmoreland over to Portland. You can see another roadway here. That's Highway 109 from the Gallatin area up through Portland. And the Sumner County, the southern border is the river and the lake. And then you've got cities along, so you can actually see what happened during that time frame. What we found in comparison to some of the counties that American Farmland Trust projected, when we look at it at an annual rate, it may be higher conversion than what their model projected. We hope to have all these models done and the one-pagers done. We're about halfway through that project. It takes a lot of time. You can imagine the amount of data that's out there, but we're getting one-pagers for every county so that policymakers can understand what rate we have of farmland loss. Another thing that's kind of an interesting topic out there is in terms of farmland conversion is what's happening with solar farms. And, you know, I don't have a lot of exact data here, but just to kind of give you an idea, everybody wants to know how many acres are being converted. Well, we talk about megawatts, and then it estimated that it takes 5 to 10 acres for each megawatt. And then we get up in gigawatts in terms of production of electricity, and that's about 1,000 megawatts. Well, the last I saw the data that we have, we've got about 3,500 acres that we know of that's already been converted from farmland to the solar panels. The one thing also to note, everyone always asks, you know, what's that 1 megawatt? How many houses is it going to generate electricity to? Well, according to the Solar Energy Industries Association, 1 megawatt will generate electricity for 164 homes. But be aware, and don't ask me how you explain this, but most of the time, a lot of these solar farms are connected to a large server farm, possibly for Facebook, Google, or something like that. I'm aware of the farm down in Elora in Lincoln County. It's tied to a server farm in Huntsville. So it's going to provide the energy for that. But just two topics there in terms of farmland loss that has kind of triggered or helped trigger the interest that we have in farm transition planning and what are our options. Another one, the age of principal owners of farmland, it's not decreasing. It kind of increases every census cycle that we have. I know the census of ag, you know, it comes out every 5 years. Sometime in 2024, we'll start getting the information on the 2022 census of ag. But I would guess if the trend continues, the average age of the primary producer on farms will be over 60 years of age when we get the data back from 2022 census of ag. And we can see just from the graph that the average age of the principal owner kind of keeps increasing. For every principal operator under 25, there's 27 that are older than 75. And I know a lot of you are aware of the challenges that are out there, especially for our younger generation to get into farming when we talk about the value of land that we're experiencing across the state. Well, when you see and hear things like that, you often get these projections like the American Farmland Trust made that 40% of the ag land in the nation will be transitioned within the next 15 years. Kachikova back in 2010, and I think she was at Kentucky at the time, said over the next decade, half of farmers will retire and will be replaced by beginning farmers. I work a lot with Dr. David Cole, who's retired from Virginia Tech, does a lot of traveling across the U.S. and across the world, making farm projections. He said back in 2010, and I was working with Dr. Cole a lot then, he said 70% of farm ground will change hands by 2025. Now, I know Dr. Cole now would say he was probably overly optimistic about that, but in working with ag blenders and others in the ag industry, he wanted them to be aware that this transition is going to take place and somebody else is going to be making decisions and management decisions on that farm, sometime in the near future. Well, what additional factors have influenced the rate of farmland change in ownership? And my good friend, Dr. Steve Isaacs, puts this graph together every year. And if I'm in a one-on-one or an in-person session, I often ask, has farmland been a good investment? And this is just the annual percentage rate in farmland real estate value. This doesn't take into effect the increase that we see in Tennessee for development purposes or things like that. And, overall, except for the Great Depression, and then back for the reason I tell some folks, the reason that I started to work with UT Extension when we created the managed program in 1986, this was the farm financial crisis of the 80s. Except for those basic two time periods, farmland has been an excellent investment. We've built a lot of net worth. Farmers may have maybe small profit margins at times, but they built net worth on that farm by holding the land, which also then leads to our decisions that we need to make about transition planning. If any of you have seen my beef presentation sometimes in the past, this is a quote I've been using for years. James Bennett, Sunbelt Farm of the Year up in Virginia, the Red House Bull Test Station, three different breeds of purebred cattle. And he was quoted as saying, "I firmly believe that adhering to tradition is the greatest obstacle to production agriculture." And just think about that for a while. I often asked if I'm out visiting someone, why do you do this now, or why do you do it this way? And oftentimes, what do you hear? Well, we've always did it this way. This is the way grandma or grandpa did it. This is the way the grandparents did it. We've always sold cattle certain month out of the year, no matter what. A lot of times it's led by tradition. Well, to take that one step further, when we talk about transition planning, no industry has a stronger tradition of passing the business and does a poor job of accomplishing it. You think about some of the phrases that we use: the home place, century farm, 3 generations working together. And I failed to submit a poll question, but the one thing I would ask is, how many of you currently have a transition plan for your farm? How many of you currently have a transition plan for your farming operation? And I'll share with you some data that we have from our Master Farm Manager class that you can see. It's kind of surprising the few people that do have a current plan. Well, this is another slide that I've used for a number of years. What are the top pitfalls in farming? And we could take each one of these topics and teach an entire session on them. But this gentleman, who was an extension agent with Virginia Tech and Farm Business Management, he noted these 11 topics. Now, the bankers will tell us, and lenders, not knowing your cost of production. That's one of the big pitfalls in farming. But just some of the ones I want to point out that we're going to touch on this evening: no plan for transferring the farm to the next generation. Think about that again. No plan for transferring the farm to the next generation, or not training the next generation. And I often ask the question here. Not too long ago, I had the opportunity to speak to the Veteran Coalition, Farmer Veteran Coalition. It was veterans who were coming out of the military, and they were either already into farming or getting into farming. And they asked each one of them, why are you interested in doing this? And some of them mentioned, and we often hear, we want to raise our children in this environment And oftentimes you hear, teach them a strong work ethic. I kind of turn that around and ask, how many times have you heard someone say, I want to teach the children or my children how to manage this business or manage this operation? That's very important when we think about transition planning. Even sometimes when we teach this series, Dr. Charlie Martinez, he covers an entire session on management transition. Well, some of the other things that we'll talk about, lack of communication is a big thing. We cover a lot in our sessions in farm management on avoiding or deferring taxes and the importance of tax preparation. We're going to talk about not managing family living expenses a little bit later on. And, you know, a lot of these things pertain to some of the issues that we're going to look at. When we talk about, and a lot of times estate planning, succession planning, transition planning, it can be all confusing. The one thing that we have, and I'll share with you a little bit later, the resource, we have a manual called Planning Today for Tomorrow's Farms. It's about a 120-page manual. It's available online. But the one thing, if you look in that manual, the definition for succession planning is a continuous process that involves transferring knowledge, skills, labor, management, control, and ownership between generations. And think about that a little bit. The one thing it alludes to a little bit, but it doesn't really say assets. And that's what everybody zeroes in on, is the assets. But there's a lot more involved than just transferring that asset, the assets, when we think about succession planning. And here's what we get to and why it's so complicated. And a lot of times we need a team to be involved. If we talk about succession planning, we talk about transition planning. You know, how do we transition to the new generation or the next generation, or the beginning farmers maybe that's coming along, and maybe they're transitioning from the older farming operation. Maybe they don't have any heirs and they're going to figure out how to transition to some beginning farmers. But we also then have estate and tax planning, business planning. How about retirement planning for the older generations? How much money will be needed during that retirement planning for the older generation? You know, is there a land use plan? But also some things over on the right side. Are we going to transition that management, and how are we going to transition the management? What about family goals? Are we all on the same page? Do we all have the same goals, or are they're different or conflicting goals, and how can we work around that? How about labor responsibilities? And then what if something doesn't work out and we need an exit strategy? So all of these things are involved in a complete succession plan. Well, here's the challenge. And I know some of you have experienced it and some of you probably think it'll happen, but you know, how do we talk about family goals and plans and communications when maybe some in the family see the farm as wanting to remain in production? They see it totally as that family farm, that family legacy, that we want to remain in production. And then other heirs see it as, how fast can we sell and convert it and convert that asset, that family legacy, into cash? And you know, these differences in family goals lead to a lot of stress. And the one thing we talk about is that if we start the planning process earlier, then there's opportunities and tools that we can use to avoid this situation, or I say not to avoid the situation, but maybe to help during this situation. One other thing that's being mentioned that I hear more frequently now across the state also, we're seeing offers for farmland that basically means multi-generational wealth that's being offered to some farmers and their families. I just had one share with me not too long ago here in Rutherford County. I know the piece of ground they're talking about. They have a 25-acre rectangular field, long road frontage, And the gentleman shared with me, he said, Kevin, I've been offered a lot of money for that. But he said, I don't know that my son or daughter, either one, want to come back to the farm. Said, my wife says she would like to sell the farm, or do we want to go ahead and sell that 25 acres? But he looked at me and he said, but that farm is my family farm. That land is my family farm. It's been here in my family for generations, and I'm struggling with trying to say that I'm going to sell it. So a lot of these situations can lead to a lot of stress among the families. Well, when we get back to another thing from Dr. Dave Cole, I first saw this from him a number of years ago when we talked about goals. 80% of Americans have no goals. 16% have goals in their mind, but never write them down. 4% write them down and make 4 to 9 times more money. Now, I asked Dr. Cole if he would to explain that, where he got this information, and he consults with a lot of business, with a lot of individuals, with a lot of operations. I don't know if it's 100% accurate. I will tell you that when I saw this, I started writing down more goals. But the point is, if we don't have a goal of making a transition plan on the farm, it probably won't happen. If the older generation, the parents, don't have the goal of making a transition plan, it probably won't happen. And often when we look at goals, we talk about short-term and long-term goals. What about family or lifestyle or business and financial goals? And notice I say everyone contributes. Oftentimes we find that families don't sit down and talk about goals, whether it's what's going to happen to the farm or what's going to happen to the business. I've used this example for years, from a number of years ago, when we would sit down with dairy farm families in a workshop setting and have them talk about their goals. And this would be a number of years ago, when a lot of the dairies we had in the state were that 100 to 150 cows, or maybe even fewer cows, but the family was providing the majority of the labor. And I still remember we asked one couple to talk and ask the lady to give her family goal, and she was the first one we come back with and ask. And she said, this was the young lady that was the city girl that married I don't remember, third or fourth generation dairy farmer, and they had raised, their children were there. But she said, we're spending too much time in terms of labor among the dairy, or with the dairy, all the things that are associated with the dairy, and said, we're neglecting our family. Said, I wish we could find an alternative so that we could spend more time and have a better family and a better lifestyle. Of course, you're in a room full of dairy producers, and the reaction was, oh, she's wanting to get out of the dairy business, and they've been in the dairy business for, generations. We asked her husband to share his goal, and he said, I'm spending way too much time and working too much in the dairy. I'm neglecting my family. I wish we could find an alternative. This husband and wife had the same goal, but they had never sat down and discussed it. They made some changes. They got out of the dairy business. One of them went in and found an off-farm job. They converted into some other farming enterprises. But the point is, they had the same goal, but they had never talked about it and how it was affecting their family and their lifestyle. So, and we get back to communication. I'm not going to share a lot on this with communication. I'll just say that if you ever have the opportunity to hear David Marison, he's with Ohio State University. He's one of the best that I know of that talks about how we should talk about communication and why farm families struggle with communication. He talks about the differences of off-farm heirs and on-farm heirs, and the fact that this is not an easy topic to discuss. This is not an easy topic to discuss. And there's a lot of times that I've got a coworker that says, this is not a topic to discuss around Thanksgiving, Christmas, or someone's birthday, because especially if you've got multiple heirs and off-farm and on-farm heirs. Another thing that causes communication differences is just how we communicate differently. The generations Me as a baby boomer, I communicate differently as Generation Z and the other ones and the ones, the younger people now. But the one thing that Dave Marison will bring home is he talks about the different styles and how you learn communication. And you know, you need to hold family business meetings and get you an outside facilitators that can help. But how he really brings his whole presentation home, he uses some characters throughout his presentation. And when he gets to the end, he says, oh, by the way, that's Aunt so and so, that's Uncle so and so, that's my dad. His father's family had a really bad breakup of a large farming operation that was up in Ohio. So his family lived through some very difficult times in terms of transition planning, is why I think Dave is such a really good communicator when we do this. Here's something I added to this presentation just a few months ago. When we talk about the challenge that we have as educators and the ones that we talk to, is how can we encourage you as farm families to start this succession planning discussion earlier than what traditionally occurs? And what I'm saying is, how can we encourage you to talk about this when you're in your 30s, 40s, 50s, versus waiting till someone's in their 60s, 70s, and 80s? Because you'll see a little bit later, there's a lot more tools that we can use that can help with this when we're much younger than when we wait till we're much older. And part of this is also the fact people are reluctant to discuss it. They don't want to discuss it. They just want to pass it on maybe to the heirs and let them figure it out. But, you know, even if you're not close to transitioning, you should have a plan. I'll repeat it. Even if you're not close to transitioning, you should have a plan. Was in Kentucky a few years ago, speaking to the Young Dairymen's Conference, and happened to be a first generation dairy family. They had bought out an existing dairy. Young couple, had 2 young children. And when I talked about this following it at the break, they came up to me and they said, you know, we're really glad you brought this up. We'd already talked and decided we want to talk to our children as they're growing up to gauge their interest in if they're coming back to the farm, or what we can do, you know, to help offset that if one of them doesn't want to come back to the farm. And they said, we see the benefit of starting that plan much earlier than what's typically normal. Well, I asked a little bit earlier, and this is where we come up with, you know, this is something that traditionally we just don't do. In the US, according to caring.com, this is their survey from 2020, 68% of adults do not have a will. Most any of the documentation that we find and studies that we find will say it's over 60%. Over 60% of adults do not have a will. And there's a lot of times that will has not been updated in years and years, and it may not be very beneficial. Okay. Well, I asked earlier, how many of you have a transition plan? We've been asking this in our Master Farm Manager class for the last 2.5 years, and it's just fairly consistent. 15 to 16% indicate they've got some kind of farm transition plan. Now, I'll put that a different way. In Master Farm Manager, you know, we'll have row crop operators, we'll have beef operators, large scale, small scale, people from all across the state. We'll have beginning farmers, value added farmers. I think it's a good representation of Tennessee agriculture because it's very diverse. Well, from the 2017 Census of Ag, the value of land, buildings, machinery, and equipment in Tennessee, this doesn't include your cows. This doesn't include any inventory of feed, seed, anything like that. So it was $48.2 billion. We know that's going to be or be increased tremendously when we see the 2022 Census of Ag. So think about that a different way. what other industry would not have a plan for only 16% of that 48.2 billion and how it transitions into the next generation? You know, I think that tells you why we want to see more people and encourage them to talk about this from that standpoint. And, you know, no matter what you do, at some point in time, your farm's going to transition. The farm that you have will transition in one way or the other. You can have a will to where the assets then will transition. You know, you can spell out how they will, or you can have a plan, you know, a transition plan so that that viable farm business can continue in some way, hopefully a legacy for your operation. Or the third, it's sale and division of assets, which usually is an end for that family's farm legacy. You know, no matter what you do, one day your farm is going to transition. There are a lot of challenges and opportunities. I'm not going to go over these in detail. You know, the greatest challenge is to go out and create and execute that transition plan. Well, a lot of times people ask, where do you start? Well, you need to talk about the older generation. You know, retirement income for the parents is most likely the first priority. Okay. Retirement income for the parents is the first priority, but you got to determine how much income do we need for the parents during their retirement? Can the farm support maybe another generation coming in, or will there be enough support for the parents from, you know, income from the farm, investment, savings, Social Security, pensions? What do we need to do about long-term care? You know, is that a consideration? Oh, and should we adjust for inflation? And speaking of inflation, this will kind of show you where we're at now. You know, prior to 2021, for 20 years, we had averaged just right at 2% annual inflation. In 21, we hit 7 annual inflation. 22 was 6.5. You know, we've got to go back to when I was a freshman at UT, back about 1980, till we've experienced this kind of level of inflation. Also, you know, we talk about, or we see the results now that says inflation is cooling, but how far are we from their Fed's target of getting it back to like 2%? So really inflationary times during this time period of time adds considerably to thinking about how much it takes to take care of the parents during their retirement. You know, one of the things that we talk about is family living expense. And when we talk about inflationary rates, how that affects family living expense, you know, oftentimes we think about bringing another generation into the farm. Is the farm profitable enough, or are we going to live off of non-farm income? Where's the family living expense coming from? We don't collect family living expense in any kind of record setting in Tennessee. So I rely on some data from Illinois and Kentucky, but I want to share this just to show how it's difficult for us typically to adjust. This is data from Illinois. So we know it would probably be row crops in general. And I flipped the figures around just to show one thing. Figure 2 shows non-farm income, off-farm income, which is relatively stable across the years from 2020 through 2021. Then you look at net farm income in the purple, very volatile. And we know that from the beef side as well. You know, we're selling really high prices right now. We've also got high input costs, but we know income or net farm income is very volatile from the ag standpoint. You know, we've got good years and then we've got the tough years. But how does that transition over on the right-hand side? And look at how these same folks were spending for family living expense. And what's interesting is that family living expense doesn't typically change. It doesn't change with the volatility that we may have in income. And, you know, I guess what bothered me a little bit when I looked at the inflationary rates, and it will be very interesting when we get the updated for the 2022 data. But when we saw the 7% increase in inflation from the feds that we've seen reported, Illinois said in 2021 they saw a 12% increase in family living expenses, and Kentucky said they saw a 28% increase. So very interesting from that standpoint. So again, my buddy Steve Isaacs and I from Kentucky and doing some co-teaching on some of this, we said family living's 100,000 plus or minus a lot. And another thing that Dr. Dave Cole brings out, and I often ask this up front in some of these seminars, he says couples over the age of 65 require 25% more in family living expense to support their lifestyle compared to the 35-year-old couple. And I'll have to say that when I first heard Dr. Cole mention that, I said, you got to tell me and explain this. And he said it's all based on the fact that that 65-year-old couple spends more money on medical costs, travel, and spending money on their grandchildren, you know. So the whole thing is, how does this affect transition planning? How does this affect retirement planning for the older generation? And I just threw in a little math. And you'll see here pretty quickly, I'm saying 365 times 15. So that's something for 15 years. But 2 times 3 times 5 times 365 times 15. 2 people. Let's say we've got the parents. 3 meals a day. $5 per person per meal. So if we go out, $10 for lunch or $10 for dinner. But if we do that on average, it's going to take $164,000. If you splurge and spend $7.50 per person per meal, it'll need close to $250,000, and we've not adjusted for inflation. So it's just a little math to show you how much money may be needed during a time period if we're looking at a transition. So where do you start with this? This is the question that I often get, especially from the younger generation. It's awkward for the kids to initiate this conversation. You know, this conversation really needs to start with the parents. And I'll be honest, most every time that we have this presentation, in person or in a webinar, oftentimes I'll get an email asking for some more information, and I get a scenario something like, Dad recently passed away. Dad did not want to discuss this, but Mom says we're now going to move forward and trying to make a plan. And you know, that's often what the issue is, that the parents or the older generation or one of the parents doesn't want to have this discussion because it is difficult. You know, oftentimes there needs to be a catalyst. And a lot of times we hear a lender or financial advisor just ask, do you have plans for transitioning to the next generation? And, you know, oftentimes we want to have a transition team, and I'll show you what that team's made up of shortly. The one thing, it's not a one and done. You need to update things periodically. Even if you just have life insurance policies and things like that, you need to go back and look at them and update those periodically. The one thing about beneficiaries, I've been sharing a true story since it was during the height of the COVID epidemic. I was working with an organization, a business, and there had been a death of an employee related to COVID. That individual had worked there for about 12 years. The lady had worked there for about 10 or 12 years. During that time period, there'd been a divorce and a remarriage. When this group looked at the health insurance, the beneficiary was still listed as the ex-husband. Nothing had been changed on the beneficiary to the life insurance. This situation worked out, but the day I was there, it was kind of stressful because it happened to be the day they discovered that. So all of these things related to, it's not a one and done. Everything needs to be gone back and revisited on a regular basis. And, you know, when I mentioned the transition team, and this again is why it takes It takes some time to develop this. You're going to have to find an estate attorney. You're going to have an estate attorney or someone that specializes in estate planning to be involved. And the attorneys will tell you that it's just as important to have a good accountant or financial planner involved as well. Oftentimes a lender is involved, and then we may have the ones that participate as a facilitator. It may be an extension educator, some type of business consultant. We had one of these sessions, and this lady emailed me and she said, I do this on a regular basis. I'm a communication specialist, and that's what I do, is go in and work with families to develop this plan. This group is an advisory board, and you may need, or the family needs, to hire a facilitator. And note this last one: go off site. This is not a kitchen table discussion or a dining room discussion. As I mentioned earlier, I've got one coworker that says this is not a discussion for Thanksgiving, Christmas, or someone's birthday, But the one thing that we also mentioned to go off site is that kitchen table or that dining room's been the focal point of that family, for a long time. It's been the focal point. They've seen the good times, the bad times. It's better to get away from that, go off site. Again, I use examples of people that I've worked with over the years. Not a few years ago, was working with this gentleman. The older generation had passed away. So it was two siblings left, one interested in the farm, one was not interested in the farm. One lived about an hour and a half away, and I was working on a plan just in the farm planning for the one that was hoping to maintain the farm. But I asked him, I said, how do you and your brother discuss this and how you're moving forward? And he said, well, that's interesting. He said, on a regular basis, brother will come and we'll start and we'll discuss. And I said, where do you have this discussion? And he said, well, that's interesting as well. He said, when brother gets here, we actually go a few miles down the road to the church that we grew up in. And he said, I still go to church there. I have a key. We'll sit out in the yard and discuss, or we'll go in. And he said, I said, well, why do you do that? And he said, well, under that circumstance, we tend to keep our emotions in check, and we have a very productive discussion. And I thought, that's a very interesting concept, but it also points out why we say you need to go off site. This is not a kitchen table discussion for the family. This is a slide that I put together and borrowed again from one of my coworkers who talks about estate planning tools. In the manual that we have, there's an entire chapter on estate planning tools. Excuse me. And this should show you why it is so important maybe to begin this discussion much earlier, because we talked about a will and things that can happen with a will. There's the powers of attorneys that are needed to be, whether it's the power of attorney for finances or for healthcare. There's lots of trusts that can be used, and we're talking about living trusts or limited trusts that can be used. Oh, there's also different forms of ownership. There's examples where an LLC can be used very effectively to transition from one generation to the next. But also I've heard from the standpoint, a lot of times if we have an LLC, that's a pass-through for taxes. So if there's a number of individuals involved, it often can increase the cost for preparing taxes. So I've heard some of the estate attorneys will tell you that instead of that, it may have been just as good an option to look at some type of life insurance policy for the older generation. But there's a lot of these options that can help generate cash or generate assets to help offset, especially those heirs that are not wanting to continue on the farm. Okay. Conservation easement, that's a big hot topic as well. It is an effective tool that's out there. What that actually does, but just be reminded that a conservation easement, what we're doing is restricting what can be done to that farm in the future. We're saying that it only can be used for farming, recreation, wildlife, okay? So what it does, it takes the value from market development down to farming. But the one thing it does, it can be sold in the future, but it totally restricts that land cannot be developed in the future. And the one thing you'll have people that farm families that are very interested in it, others that are not, because it lasts through perpetuity. And some families will say, it's something I would be interested in, but I don't want to tie the hands of the future generation. So we say this is something, it's totally dependent on the family. If they think that's what they want to do to conserve this land for generations to come, it's a tool that can be used. There's some tax savings that will occur with federal taxes if this is utilized, but it's just one option that's out there. Disability long-term care insurance, prepayment or burial insurance is a great thing in terms of estate planning. My father was a minister, and I can remember as many times him sharing the stories of families that were really shocked at two things, especially if it's an unexpected death. One was the cost of a funeral. The other was not knowing the wishes of that person and what should happen with their estate at burial or anything like that. Here's where sometimes I step on some toes a little bit, especially with the younger generation. You need to involve and prepare the family. Working here does not necessarily qualify you to be the manager of the operation automatically. Sometimes we often hear people say that you need to go off and work at another location or another operation before coming back to the farm. I was on a webinar when somebody actually clarified that and said, go work at another operation, get a promotion, and then come back to the farm. But, working here does not necessarily qualify you to be the manager. Whatever you do, don't protect the next generation from current business problems or successes. And basically, I'm asking, has the next generation seen the books? Has the next generation seen the books? Where we as farm management specialists see this a lot of times, though, is during when there's financial issues. You've got a younger generation that may be in their 50s that just realize, oh, this farm may be going into bankruptcy, and I've worked 50 years and don't have anything to show for it. But, whether that it's a successful business or it's a business that's facing some financial difficulty, has the next generation seen the books? My good friend, Dr. Cole, he called me up a few years ago. He was out in the Midwest, because this is something we bring up at most every meeting we're together at, is has the next generation seen the books? And he said, Kev, I got you beat on, has the next generation seen the books? He had made this presentation, and this gentleman came up to him afterwards, and he followed this gentleman for several years after he made this initial deal. He said, so you think I should show the boys the books, eh? And the gentleman at that time was in his late 80s. He followed him into his early 90s. The boys were in their 60s and maybe early 70s, but had never seen the books for the operation. It had been a successful Midwestern grain operation. The boys they raised their families. They had been paid a salary, but the boys in their 70s and 80s had never seen the books. Here's another thing. Treat siblings or heirs fairly, not necessarily equally. And notice the next one, equal may not be possible or even desirable. You often hear someone say there was a 300-acre farm divided among the three siblings, 100 acres each. Was that equal? Probably not. Failure to define equal and fair is not a reason to do nothing. And I'll pose this question. How about the younger generation, one of the siblings that stayed on the farm and helped on the farm? should they get a larger share than a sibling that was not on the farm? And most of them will say, I made this presentation, I think it was at UT Martin a few years ago, and somebody said, yeah, I had sweat equity in that operation. And a lot of people will say, yes, that's building up the net worth of that farm. Do they deserve a share? I will often ask, how were they compensated during that time? I work with one family operation that's in a cooperation. It's incorporated. There's one of the three siblings that manages and provides labor on the farm. He is paid not only a labor fee, but a management fee as well. So he gets some compensation. But a lot of times the formulas will tell you that's out there, it may be a 2-to-1 or 3-to-1 share because of building up that net worth. But again, it's up to the parents to determine that, you know. Don't neglect the spouses. That's the one thing that also everyone communicates. That may not be a priority for some, but it's something that really needs to be there in terms of communication. Here's a little bit of touch on that management decision making, and where we talk about transferring management. And have you taught the next generation how to manage your operation? Again, one kind of practice that we do, and I got this again from Dr. Cole, if you've got several people involved with managing an operation, whether it's a farming operation, a small business, or anything like that, bring them in, set them all down, pull one name out of the hat and say, that person is no longer with you. What does that person know about your operation that no one else does? What do they know about the operation and how it can move forward that no one else does? I threw in a little genetics here. Management and leadership often have a low heritability coefficient. You know, leaders and managers are trained, not born, and most of us as parents don't believe that right off the bat. But if we want to help that younger generation, make sure we train them as leaders and managers, you know, and it's managing is a continual process. Here's why it's so tough in farming. The older generation is reluctant to share those management responsibilities because it's tradition that we don't share them. And the younger generation is reluctant to ask for more management responsibilities. So that's the challenge we get into. There's a lot of tasks in terms of management that we can share and have the younger generation do, whether it's being involved in record keeping, tax preparation, you know, how about rental agreements, employee relations with if there's hired help involved, agency responsibilities, how about them being responsible for contacting the lenders or insurance or FSA? There's a lot of way to slowly work them into the management of the operation. Why do these transitions fail? And most of you know this. There's nothing we can do about those unexpected events. You know, an untimely death or marriage, divorce, weather, hopefully we're somewhat prepared for them. You know, strengths don't often align with the business needs. And again, an opportunity or an obligation. Steve Isaacs and I co-wrote an article on this a few years ago. And you think about this, you know, one, sometime, does the younger generation want to farm? And oftentimes we wrote up the example of, if you have someone that's, say, in marketing, and they've been in marketing for some time, and they decide they want to go back to school and get a law degree, oftentimes we hear them say they changed careers. And everybody says, oh, look what they've done. They've changed careers and they've moved forward with it. But if we have some younger individual that's involved with a farming operation and they decide that they want to, okay, change careers, leave that farming operation and maybe go in and be an attorney or go into marketing, oftentimes, how is that looked on in our industry? Maybe not the most positive. Well, they left that farming operation. They don't want to continue and have that tradition that's been there for a number of years. So that's a challenge as well. And, you know, a lot of times the three down at the bottom, if we don't have the parents' approval and affirmation to go and move forward, it's really difficult to have a transition plan. And if we can't put aside our differences with the siblings or maybe bring in someone to assist with that, and that failure to communicate leads to most everything and why transitions fail. I mentioned earlier, I'd show you some resources. If you'll just search for Tennessee Farmland Legacy, this entire manual is available online. You can print it out either by chapter. Each chapter is a PDF or whole, or just have it as a resource online. It has you working through several things. How you find a professional is one of the chapters in there. The estate planning tools, record keeping, taking stock in your estate is in there. Just some of the chapters that are involved. We also in Ag Econ, we do a lot of work with the University of Minnesota. We get a lot of our software that we do planning with from them. They have a kind of an online app called Ag Transitions that you can go. You have to give them a email to sign up. There's no charge. That's just how they keep everything individual. But it's like an online app that'll help or lead you through a transition plan. And there's lots of other resources that are out there. We have one additional resource that we have across the state, and we use this. There's an attorney in Knoxville that we've used for some of our farmland legacy meetings for a number of years. And they had a booklet named What My Family Should Know. And during COVID, they actually converted this booklet over to a fillable PDF file. If you're interested, let me know. I'll have my email up in a minute. Send me an email. I can send this to you. We have to include, this is not an endorsement, but we have to include a disclaimer when we send this. But this booklet allows anyone to fill in a lot of information. And I try to encourage the people that attend these sessions, even if you don't do a transition plan, filling out this information for What My Family Should Know would be very, very helpful to your heirs in the future, because you can put down just general information regarding family records. You actually put in information regarding your employer benefits that you have, that you participate in, where your investments are located, just in case something happens and someone tries to find them. I'll just tell you the example my wife has experienced in a little over a year, 2 unexpected deaths within her family. One was a cousin, 56 years old. He was never married, no children. His mother, who was 86, according to the will, was the executor of his estate, and the will hadn't been updated since 1998. Had no idea where anything was located. It was a challenge to go back and find this information, but a lot of this can be included in this one PDF file with your last will and testament, any information on the living will, any instructions regarding funeral service can be included. The one thing I do put in here, it kind of as a caution, it does ask for sensitive data, social security numbers or bank account numbers. That's certainly optional. You don't have to include them, but if you do, make sure it's in a secure location. But it is a great document that's available and used across the state and in others. And you'll often find estate attorneys that have something very similar to this, but this is one of the best ones that we've found and used. I'll close out with just some kind of friendly reminders that I have. Communicate and plan with the family to develop today's best solution for your farm's legacy. That goes all the way back to when I was in grad school, and I was in grad school about the time that we started with personal computers, with PCs. I was in the first group of extension employees that had portable computers, but when I was in grad school, I was the guinea pig testing a lot of things with the computer. And my major professor would come in, and I was modeling a large, actually feedlot type situation with cattle. And my major professor would say, Ferguson, we're going to figure out what today's best solution is. He said, it may change tomorrow when we get more information and maybe better information, but our goal today is just to come up with what today's best solution is. And I've remembered that ever since. I would ask you, if you're managing your operation, what knowledge has not been transferred to someone else? What do you have that someone else doesn't know about? Don't leave the burden of making decisions to the surviving spouse or the next generation. You know, it can be so much easier to discuss things like that in advance. And, you know, did I mention communication? Yeah, several times. And just be open about your wishes and your goals. You know, talk to your kids, talk to your spouse, your parents, your grandparents, that advisory team. Communication is the key to all this. And, you know, there's no time like today to start. There's no time like today to start. So there's my contact information. If you'd like, you can either send me or Mallory a request. She has a copy of this presentation in a PDF format, if you'd like to have a copy of that. So I think you can just send that on to Mallory or to me, and we'll get you a copy. All right. I'm going to stop my sharing.
Perfect. Thank you, Mr. Ferguson. We really appreciate you joining us for our first night here on the webinar series. If anybody has any questions or comments for Mr. Ferguson to bring up while we've got him tonight, you can either use the chat or the Q&A box. I see that we have some frequent users of that, so I really appreciate that. But I'll stay on for a couple of minutes if anybody has any questions or comments to talk to him about. And besides that, we really appreciate you.
No problem. And I should make one other comment across that I do work as a managed coordinator across the state, and we do have 9 farm management specialists that are headquartered across the state that are all involved with helping make farm management decisions. We're involved with doing one-on-one work with farmers. Just reach out to your local extension agent, or you know, get online and look for the Tennessee Managed Program, and we'll be able to assist you with that. I see lots of comments that you know, I agree with. It's going to be really interesting, the Blue Oval City. We hope that the Center of Farm Management continues to kind of be able to continue to build on this data that we're looking at. And, you know, in 10 years, what will it look like in terms of how much land has been taken up by Blue Oval City and the surrounding area? So, okay. I'm just scrolling through the that's interesting. You know, farming employs almost no one and pays little taxes. You know, that's an interesting concept. I don't know the defining almost no one. I worked with one farmer in the state recently that he has 500 employees. Large, still family operation. So now we do see continued consolidation in agriculture. We do see fewer farms. The average size of farms keeps increasing. So that's interesting. And also remember, on property taxes is only for the land. You know, it doesn't include, when we talk about greenbelt, it's only for the land we have. We don't have greenbelt issues for, you know, a lot of our investments in buildings and our specialty buildings and everything that we have. Somebody from Lick Skillet. Any other comments, questions? I'm not seeing any.
Crystal Bowers had one about the link for the farmland legacy. Did we get that one covered?
Just search for, it's farmlandlegacy.tennessee.edu. But if you'll do just a search for Tennessee Farmland Legacy, it should pop up.
Good deal.
The workbook is there and some other resources as well.
Good deal. All right. As far as attendance for everyone, I forgot to mention this as well. Our Zoom account will create an attendance record after the conclusion of every one of our meetings. And that record sheet will get sent to county agents. And so you can contact your county agent which you signed up with to make sure that you are receiving your credits and make sure that we're meeting all of those requirements for our certifications as well. So if anybody has any questions about those, Dr. Mason or I or your home county agent can answer those too.
Yeah, you've got a lot of messages that are telling, what you're seeing, what you're experiencing across the state. And, that's exactly what we're seeing. And, it's the fact that this is a big topic right now. And Farm Bureau's policy development meetings, this was a topic that now has been discussed for 2 years, so. And I will share, I haven't with you so far, Mallory, but I'll share with you what my family should know as well, so that you can pass it on.
Good deal. Good deal. All right. Did you see the PDF request question from Van Thompson? I think that's the last one.
Yes. Okay. Yeah, I don't have the emails though. You would have the emails. Somebody will have to email me directly for me to respond back, because I don't have the emails of the participants. So.
Okay. Sorry.
Yeah.
We just had a quick question about the PDF that they should request from the Knoxville law firm to put together.
Yeah.
Maybe that could be one that they reach out to you directly for more information.
Yes, the What My Family Should Know booklet. Yeah, just email me directly, or I can send it off, and that's fine. I'll forward it to you so you have it. What we have to do is just when we forward that, it's got a disclaimer with it that needs to be forwarded out. That's just the issue that we have.
Got it. The ones who also requested a copy of the PDF of the What My Family Should Know, if you'll send an email to me, once I get that from Mr. Ferguson, I'll be sure to send that to you guys as well. But if no one else has any questions, I think we'll end tonight. We certainly thank you for joining us here for the first night. Thank you, Mr. Ferguson, for being our speaker for the first night, and we'll see you again Thursday. So see you then.
Good job. Thanks.
Thanks.